Welcome to the Coming Home Well podcast, the show that educates, supports, and advocates for the veteran community. Your host, Dr. Tyler Pieron, U.S. Army retired, will bring you exciting conversations with amazing guests about resources, research, and military history, all geared to helping our warriors to come home well. Here's your host, Dr. Tyler Pieron.
Welcome back to Coming Home Well. I'm your host, Tyler Pieron, and today we're going to be talking about transition, as we often do. And to help us with that, we have a very great author. I really love the book. It is From Bunker Hill to the Boardroom, Battle-Tested Leadership for Today's Executives by Andy Moye. He has a PhD. He's done a bunch of things. He was in the Navy. But now he's here to talk about that transition and how do you take those skills that you learned in the military and apply them to the executive world, or the civilian world, as some might call it. Andy, thank you so much for joining us on Coming Home Well.
Yeah, Tyler, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So let's talk about you just for a minute. You served in the Navy. You're on the airplanes. What were you doing?
Yeah. It's funny. I tell a story about my dad because he was an Army guy, and we'll talk more about my family. But he told me, just so you know, he told me if I joined the Army, he'd disown me. And so I ended up joining the Navy. That's a long story. But yeah, I got into the Navy. Didn't really have a love for flying airplanes or anything like that, but just sort of tested into it and said, yeah, that sounds great. And you kind of go through flight school and in the Navy, the way the courses work. As officers, I went through officer candidate school, so I didn't go to the academy or anything like that, but did officer candidate school and kind of went through the flight training, and you kind of test through all those different phases and sort of at some point pick your airplane if you have the ability to do that. And I'm kind of a taller guy. I didn't want to be cramped in a jet, right? That was sort of number one. Helicopters seemed like a bad idea, just generally. And so, the Navy flew this airplane called the P-3 Orion. Been in service since the 60s. It was essentially an airplane designed in the 40s, and then they retrofitted in the 60s. Essentially a way for the United States military to keep track of Russian submarines during the Cold War. And it's essentially an anti-submarine warfare airplane. Obviously, with the fall of the Soviet Union, late 80s, early 90s, they retrofitted a lot of the airplanes to do reconnaissance and intelligence gathering and things like that, because ages before drones and unmanned vehicles, right? So we did a lot of that kind of stuff in Iraq, a lot of just kind of eye in the sky type things, working with special forces, working with SEALs, working with Marine recon type guys and things like that. And we were there. I was deployed a couple of times. Once when we were out in the Mediterranean during 9/11, and then we were deployed again during 2003 when we made the push into Iraq and the beginning of that war. So yeah, that was my time flying this crazy airplane called the P-3 Orion.
Well, that's a fascinating story. I've seen them. I use that type of work all the time, getting all the information from all the birds. Now it's mostly drones, but there's still manned aircraft up there. And you mentioned a little bit about your family. That's one thing I took away from your book. It's you didn't join the military on a lark. If I could have gone back and done it all over again, I wouldn't have joined the Army. I would have joined the Air Force. I realized that, but I wouldn't change a thing. But if I could do it all over, I would have joined the Air Force. But you had an entire lineage of service.
Yeah, and I didn't know it. My dad served, and I knew that, but it wasn't until about kind of COVID timeframe that my son kind of wanted to get to know our family a little bit more. Hey, can we take a DNA test and learn more about the family? And sure, why not? And so we did that, and you kind of get going in the application. And I knew my dad was from Florida and had some relatives there, and just kind of was going through. You kind of go to this rabbit hole pretty quick. It's kind of fun. And the technology these days, they're pulling information from all over the world, and they can quickly, hey, here's a birth certificate, and we think this is your father. And so you can kind of quickly do the research. And what I realized is on my dad's side, all the way till about the mid 1600s, the Moyes were pretty prominent in the South. And more interestingly, obviously, my dad was in Vietnam. He had a great grandfather who fought in the Civil War, and then his great grandfather and great grandfather fought in the Revolutionary War in the North Carolina militia, which I just kind of found fascinating. We kind of had this lineage, 250 years going back to the beginning of of the United States. And now this year with the 250th birthday and all of those kind of things, really kind of interesting to me that was the case. And I posted something about it on LinkedIn a few years ago, and fortunately for me, a publisher kind of picked up the story and kind of said, hey, with your background, you should write a book about this, right? You should kind of write something that's going to be, impact other people, or maybe a leadership type lesson type book, and that kind of thing. So that's how the whole genesis of the book came about.
So you weren't sitting there with, bursting to write a book. Somebody had actually reached out to you and said, "Hey, you got
Yeah.
to write a book. People would be interested."
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's just, I always think about life, it's all about sort of your exposure to luck, and the more opportunity, surface area you sort of give yourself to be lucky.
Hmm.
And that means just talking to the guy next to you on the airplane, or, just being really present in social media and things like that. Maybe a lesson for vets. The luckier you kind of get, right? People kind of
Hmm.
find you, and you have to look at those opportunities. I actually said no at first. I'm like, I don't have time to write a book. Like, you're crazy, those kind of things. But as I kind of sat and thought about it, I really kind of, I thought about it from two perspectives. One, I think there are lessons as you get older, right, Tyler? You kind of realize, hey, I'm no longer a young buck. I actually know a couple things. Maybe I should spread some of those leadership lessons, some of the hard-earned lessons that I've learned over time. And secondly, it was really sort of a way for me to get a little bit deeper and research my family, and sort of something for my family too. So I hope people take something out of it, from a leadership perspective, and they can go and use that in their daily life.
And that's where the From Bunker Hill to the Boardroom comes about. I thought
Right.
it was really fascinating. I mean, anytime you start digging into your family history of
Yeah.
service, and especially if, a long lineage like that, but it's
Yeah.
fascinating. You try to find more and more because the records are sometimes there and sometimes they're
Yeah.
not, and
Yeah.
you dig through that. But it's really lesson learned of, hey, if you know where you come from, you know a little bit more about where you want to go.
That's right.
So you
That's right.
wrote the book, and I like the anecdotes throughout the book. You bring in a bunch of historical examples. I think
Yeah.
that's sort of what catches me. I love history, and
Yeah.
so when I'm reading it, I was like, oh yeah, check this out. But there's some like really interesting themes that sort of
Yeah.
been distilled in the book, and
Yeah.
so I'll let you talk about them. But like the
Sure.
purpose, the adaptive
Yeah.
intelligence, empowered
Yeah.
teams, I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah.
I get
No,
that because those were pretty easy for me to get
right.
as
Yeah.
concepts.
Yeah. And I think as military leaders, and I was really fortunate, General Stanley McChrystal, who wrote a great book called Team of Teams, and he obviously was the Joint Special Operations Commander in Iraq, and Allied forces in Afghanistan. You know, um, I met him at a conference somewhere and reached out to me. He said, "Send me the book," and I sent it to him, and he read it. And he said, "I'll write your forward." I thought it was, because he makes sense, right? And
Yeah.
so the lessons are, we kind of thought about, are there themes? Can you find leadership principles from the Revolutionary War, from the Civil War, from the Vietnam era, from Iraq, from today's boardroom, that still are consistent.
Hmm.
And you're right. So we sort of distilled them down to these three themes. The first is about purpose, right? And today, a lot of people are catching on to that. But in the 80s and 90s, the Jack Welch era of management leadership and things like that, everything was about vision. Right? You need to, as a leader in the civilian world, no matter what you do, you need to paint a vision of, and everybody's going to follow you because you have this vision. But the reality is, that's not how people think. People have their own purpose for doing something. And the interesting thing, I think, is as veterans transition, one of the toughest things is that when we're all in the military and we're wearing the same uniform, we're all bound by the same code. We're all
Hmm.
we're all there to be there. We know the rules of the game. We know what's going on. We understand rank, and we understand chain of command, those kind of things. Not so, in the civilian world. And when you're trying to keep a company together of 50 people, there's nothing that holds anybody there. Everybody works there at will. They
Hmm.
can quit tomorrow for any purpose they want to do that. And so really, how do we as leaders, get the most out of people and inspire them? That was kind of the first lesson, was this idea. Everybody has a different purpose in life. You as a frontline manager or as a CEO or whatever, need to understand why your people are working there. And sometimes the answer is just, hey, I need a paycheck. And that's okay, right? There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes
That's
the
first
answer is,
and foremost.
yeah, exactly. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's, hey, I really like the work we do. Or, in my case, I do a lot of work in healthcare and cancer diagnosis and things like that. there's a personal reason. My mom died of cancer or something, and so they find it personal. So there's always a reason, and getting to the
Hmm.
bottom of that's kind of leaders, responsibility, I think. That's sort of lesson number one. Lesson number two, yeah, as anyone who's been in the military knows, being adaptive and having adaptive intelligence is necessary to your life. I tell a story in the book about my dad who was in 1968 in Vietnam and was there during the Tet Offensive. And one of the things I didn't really realize during the Vietnam War was, the Viet Cong actually took over most of Saigon
Hmm.
during that assault. And so you had soldiers who were trained to do jungle and riverine operations suddenly had to go door to door and clear houses, right? And so you were in the army, the challenge that sort of takes to be that adaptive and that quick to try to figure out how to do that. So if you try to take the same tactics you had in the jungle and you try to take them on the streets of Saigon, it's not going to work, right? So I just had this conversation today with another CEO, another leader. I'm like, you can't take yesterday's tactics and apply them to today's world. We have to always be adapting. And I think it's something as leaders we don't really talk enough about is having that adaptive, flexible mindset. And it's something that's super important that we talk about in the book. And then the third piece is I always think this is really important is empowered teams. And
Hmm.
again, from a military perspective, everybody understands the notion of commander's intent, right? You have a command, and so for good reason, right? You start at the beginning of a mission. Hey, the objective is to take the hill. Here are the rules of engagement. Here's what we can't do. Here's what happens. And if the platoon captain, gets it, the sergeant needs to take over and know what to do, right? That's necessary in combat. In the civilian world, unfortunately, leaders, we don't always give our commanders intent. And I've just seen it too much in my civilian career. Leaders who expect all their people to read their mind somehow about what we're doing and why we're doing it here,
Hmm.
or they just think, well, you're earning a paycheck, shut up, and you should just do what I say. That also
Yeah.
doesn't work, in the civilian world. So commander's intent, and then empowering your teams with the commander's intent, and then we talk about this concept of judging their judgment, not the outcome, right? And a lot of times we're so concerned about our employees. What was the final outcome? Oh, we gave the client a 50% discount. We were not supposed to do that. But why did we do it? What was the judgment that led to that? And there may be great reason for it. If you're judging your people's judgment, not the outcome, you'll typically get much better employees and you much better outcomes from a business perspective. So we try to tie all those really lessons learned, again, these battle tested lessons over 250 years, and try it in every chapter to apply it to something modern, something where a business leader or manager on the shop floor or frontline leader anywhere can sort of take away and work with every day.
I was sitting there, and as I was reading the book, I was thinking of all these situations where it definitely applies.
Yeah.
I work a lot and see a lot of foreign militaries. You'll read a ton of articles where they fall apart is they don't have that NCO core that the U.S. military is famous
Yeah.
for,
That's
where
right.
if
Yeah.
the platoon leader is taken out,
Yeah.
everything stops. If you look at what's going on with Russia and
Yeah.
Ukraine on the Russian
Yeah.
side, if the officer is taken out, boom, everything falls apart because
Yeah.
they don't have that leadership throughout the NCO Corps or around the world. It really doesn't matter, which is
Right.
really about that empowered team of, hey, I know what I'm
Right.
supposed to be doing. I know what
Yep.
success looks like. And
Yep.
I really know what the purpose is. What are we
Yeah.
trying to do? And then,
Yeah.
the adaptive part, I was thinking as you were talking, I was remembering back in 2003, I was in Iraq as we were going in, and they realized they didn't really need all these chem bio soldiers. They had brigades of them.
Yeah.
And they said,
Yeah.
hey, you guys are great soldiers. You're going to go be doing basically infantry missions,
Yeah.
clearing door to door and being soldiers. And they're like, hey, we're chem bio soldiers. And they're like, yeah, soldiers is the key word. And
Right. Yeah.
like
Yeah.
they were not infantry. They're not, it's not what they
Yeah.
were expecting, but they had to
Yeah.
be adaptive and go and adopt this entirely new mission area
Yeah.
because there was no need, they realized very quickly, for the WMD
Yeah.
stuff. And I was
Yeah.
like, nowhere else can you really do that in the civilian world without a lot of firing and rehiring
Yeah.
and getting that flexibility. Now, if you are probably more flexible and think about it that way, hey, we're
Yeah.
changing this, who wants to do it? You
Right.
probably
Right.
already have a fairly decent workforce to start with.
Yeah. the reality is in the civilian world, I think this is one of the hardest things for vets to also transition into, although there's a lot of things that it's hard, is that inflexible mindset. There's very much like, here's a job description.
Hmm.
Here's what you're supposed to be doing, right? And I think as soldiers or sailors or Marines or whatever, we're sort of used to exactly what you said. Hey, I was a chem bio guy. Nope, now you're clearing houses. Okay, and now we're going to go do that. And a lot of these guys sort of get in there and they're like, well, I can do all these other things. And there's a boss who says, that's not your job. Don't do that, right? And you sort of get this, there's a lot of discouragement, I think, early, in that process of trying to figure out, where do I fit? What's my purpose in a civilian world? How do I can do more. Why aren't they letting me do more? Right.
Right.
Like all these sort of things.
That's not your job is it's probably the
Yeah,
biggest
yeah,
morale killer.
yeah. And I would tell you, for me, trying to sort of proselytize these ideas to people I work with and startups, all that kind of thing. The idea of this inflexible job description, I think it needs to go to the way of the dinosaur. It just does. I think we need to understand people's skill set. Today you might be, working on a marketing project. Tomorrow you might need to work on an operational project. The next day working with a customer. All of those things, I think, especially in small organizations, you have to have them, and you have to have the kind of people who can do it. And I think vets are kind of some of the best groups that can do that.
As long as you're empowering them with the other parts of those discussions,
Yep.
it's definitely one of the areas I've seen in talking to a lot of groups and a lot of different organizations is a lot of places want to hire vets, but
Yeah.
they don't do the things that keep vets employed. And
Right.
so you'll
Right.
see that time and again, they have lots of efforts and lots of very emphasis on hiring veterans. And all of a sudden, over time, they're hemorrhaging those same veterans that they spent a
Right.
lot of time and effort to hire. And I think you're
Yeah.
really hitting the nail on the head about
Yeah.
why that happens. The
Yeah.
compartmentalization, the rigor of that's your job, that's
Yeah.
someone else's job.
Yeah.
I'm not even going to talk about unions or anything. I'm talking about,
No, that's right. That's right. Yeah, I think, part of that is, it's interesting you say that, because when I was getting out in my tradition, it was very difficult, and I always talk about the Superman cape.
Mhm.
When you wear the uniform, you also wear the S in the cape, right? You kind of have that, level of self-respect, and where you fit, and you're part of something bigger, and all of those kind of things. When it comes off, you're just sort of nobody, right? And my first job out of the military was doing what we called medical sales. Essentially going doctor's office to doctor's office, trying to catch a doctor in between a break and sell them something. And it was really hard, a little
Mhm.
humbling, right? It was you would bring lunch to a staff of nurses who were working hard and all that kind of stuff, but didn't necessarily too grateful, for what you were doing. And I thought, 3 months in, I don't know. I might have to go back in the reserves. I don't know if this is for me. But eventually I found some purpose, in the work that we were doing and the products we're selling, and got to know a doctor who sort of said, "Hey, if you didn't show up in my office, this patient would have died," something like that. And I go into the story in other places, but you start to try to find where the purposes are, and then you start to realize, well, I can impact organizations in different ways. And if I do that well, and I do that, then you can kind of find your way in the world. And I was fortunate that I was able to do that. So I definitely get it. It's not easy. And a lot of organizations too, I think, kind of overdo it. They think that veterans need some coddling, right? Some sort of like special arrangement in a lot of ways. And most of us we just want to do the job, right?
Yeah.
We're everyone has GTD degrees, right? Get things done, right? And so you don't want to be coddled and put in a box, somehow. It's like, hey, give me the responsibility and give me the tools and the authority to get done what I need to get done. So it's a lot of challenge for sure. And I just kind of, part of the book too is hoping, leaders hear, hey, these military lessons are important, and vets really are good, and we should hire more of them.
So as I was reading the book, I was like, this guy's got some pretty interesting history in the Navy.
Yeah.
So what did you have to actively unlearn from your time in the Navy to succeed as an executive?
Yeah, boy, that's a great question. I think kind of some of the stuff we already talked about. I mean, there is no question in the military, and while it's a little looser in some commands and tighter in others, those kind of things, there is always a chain of command.
Hmm.
And the chain of command is, sacrosanct, right? Like you don't go over the next ranks guys to the skipper, you don't do those kind of things. And I think for me, trying to unlearn the rules, there's not a lot of rules in the civilian world. I mean, there are, don't get me wrong, there are
There's
HR
probably some
rules.
laws and a lot more
Yeah,
unwritten rules,
there are
but
those kind of things, but really, it's a dog eat dog world, and it's
hmm
a political one, right? Meaning, the guy next to you is cozying up to the boss's boss, hey, what, but this is the way sometimes the game is played. And so I think it's really challenging, for folks who don't want to play politics. They don't want to play these games. They want to be recognized for their merit, move up based on their merit. I just, unfortunately, it's not the way the world works, right? You have to sort of, and it doesn't mean you go, kiss the next boss's, backside or anything, that kind of stuff. But you do have to recognize that it's not the same as the military. That the
hmm
rules in any organization, civilian organization, are what they are. Sometimes there's a boss that's like, everything runs through the boss, and that's the way it is. Sometimes it's a loose organization. If it's a big company, there may be a little bit more hierarchical thing. I think a lot of vets who get into companies like Johnson and Johnson or Walmart or Home Depot, these are really large organizations with sort of some similar feeling like hierarchies, right? But smaller organizations, mid-tier organizations, there's really no rules to how you operate. It's really about getting the job done in a
hmm
lot of ways. And so I think a lot of vets maybe struggle with that. I certainly struggled with that in seeing people get promoted, that I knew darn well should have been promoted, right? And because they were, kissing butt and all that kind of stuff. So
yeah, you
it,
recognize
it
the
is, it's
merit
hard.
from the
Yeah,
friendships and the other relationships, and
right.
that those relationships matter a lot, and
Yeah,
probably
yeah, they do.
more.
They do. Yeah, they do. And the thing you realize though too is like how many great people there are out there. And it's interesting. During my transition, there was a period of time, and I don't know if you had the same experience. So kind of 2006, 2007, as I was transitioning, there was sort of this push for vets to sort of downplay their veteranness in the
Hmm.
civilian world, meaning don't talk about that. You need to conform now. You're out in the real world. You need to conform, and you don't talk about your time in Iraq, and you don't talk about your combat. You don't do that, right? You're here now. You don't want to scare people, right? This kind of weird sort of
Well, it's also
feeling.
the hey, everybody has PTSD
Sure. Yeah.
thought
Yeah.
that people would have.
Yeah, exactly. And you don't want to cause any comment. And now looking back on it, I'm like, man, what a bunch of crap, And I think now we sort of need to recognize all people for their merits, and particularly our veterans as they come out and their skill sets, and it's who they are, right? And we shouldn't shy
Hmm.
away from it. And I certainly over the last 5 years or longer have gotten more involved in veteran organizations and in connecting with other veteran entrepreneurs, other veteran CEOs, and things like that, because it's been really important and helpful for me to recognize there is this whole support network out there that I wish that I had tapped into when I was younger, coming out of the military. I just didn't do it. I just felt like I had to like make a break, right? I have
Hmm.
to, okay, they're telling me I have to go and be a civilian now, and that's what I have to be. And I think it was a mistake, and I hope a lot of vets sort of recognize there are support, reach out, use your support networks, use the kind of training and coaching that's out there, because there is a lot of resources.
And you had mentioned, and finding your purpose and finding your tribe are things that we talk a lot about in this
Yeah.
organization because, you know, when you're in the military, you get the tribe part.
Yeah.
The rank, the structures, you can be in a different service and you can sort of shape how well somebody is by their bearing, by their awards,
Yep.
or what
Yep.
they do, that kind of thing. Whereas in the civilian world, none of that exists.
Yeah.
You can fake it till you make it, and there's a lot of people who do.
Yeah. Right.
But we're talking a little bit about the qualification process, and
Yeah.
in the civilian world, there are some qualifications, but generally, if you're a great salesman, you could have a GED and did a couple years in juvie. As long as you're
Yeah.
selling, you are
You
you are
got it.
doing great.
Yep.
Where
That's
in the
exactly
military,
right.
we know that isn't going to be the case. You got a
Yeah.
pristine record, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, That's totally a different mindset that I
It
think a
is.
lot of veterans are missing out on because they don't recognize, hey, yeah, this is a whole different ball of wax and a
It
different
is.
game, and the rules are
Yep.
much more fluid.
You got it. That's exactly right. I mean, we kind of were talking about this. I mean, when I got out, as I kind of got into the healthcare space, I got my MBA because I didn't know anything about business. I felt like I had to have an MBA. I had to
Hmm.
have one.
That's
How else
the
am I?
entry
Right.
degree.
Yeah. How else am I going to know what's going on here? And then as I, got moving through my career again, all the higher level folks I talked to had advanced degrees. Well, I got to get a PhD. It's the only thing. So I was chasing quals,
Hmm.
right, myself so that I was not feeling that same imposter syndrome. Right. And I think in the military, people don't really get imposter syndrome because to your point, you go out to the range, you fire your weapon, whatever, the gunny comes over and says, you're certified, you're now rifleman and you're qualified to fire that gun. Okay. Right. So now I'm not an imposter. He told me I could shoot it. Right. So, same in an airplane, right? You go
Hmm.
through a check flight, you go through all the training, and an instructor pilot or the commanding officer says, Moye, you're certified. You now are, this is your patch. You put the patch on and you're now this qualification. So, okay, right? So you're always having those chases. You're exactly right. But in the civilian world, you kind of make your own rules. You're exactly right.
Hmm.
If you can sell to anybody, nobody's going to give you some, piece of paper that says you're now qualified, go sell.
Right.
Or, hey, if you can lead a warehouse or run a distribution center, like there's no qualification. Like I can do it, and everybody leads me, and I know how to do it. You can do it, right? So
Right.
I think it does. People, getting out, sort of need to recognize that imposter syndrome is always going to be there, but you just need to recognize it's about growth. You're always going to feel a little uncomfortable. Do something new. You go do it, right? And
Hmm.
find out where the limits are and where you're failing, because that you'll never know if you don't get there, right? If you don't get to the place where you're failing, then you'll never know where the limits are.
So veterans often have a very different definition of a bad day. We're both in Iraq,
Yeah,
Afghanistan. When things go
yeah,
bad, they go horribly bad. But when an executive is, flipping
yeah,
out over a missed quarterly forecast or something like that, how do you maintain, or how would you advise folks to maintain perspective when,
yeah.
the civilian peers are freaking out and you're like, well, no one's dying, uh, you know.
The number of times I've said those things like, hey, I was in combat, like, and then people will ask you, why do you stay so calm? You seem so calm. Well, I mean, like, look, no one's going to die, right? Like this is, the case. Now, I work in healthcare and some of the things we do, patients' lives are on the line. And so there is some of the same urgency and some of the things that we do, which I think does impact the way we operate. But yeah, from a financial perspective, for those kind of things, I think it's a superpower, right? I think we as vets need to embrace that superpower, right? The ability to sort of, I talk about tolerate a lot of pain, like we all
Yeah.
can tolerate a lot of pain. And there are people you just realize, the littlest things, and you're like, what is wrong with you, right? But at the end of the day, the best sort of senior executives and senior leaders and the right managers, and they're not all of them out there, they're not all this way, but I would say the majority of big company executives, like they recognize the kinds of people who can manage under pressure, who can deal with a lot of stress, who can manage those kind of things. And I think for veterans, that's a superpower. And you have to kind of lean into that ability to be like, hey, when you're talking about, calm under pressure, here I was, dealing with, gunfire and whatever the situation was. I got no problems getting, the deliveries from A to B. you
Yeah.
know, and so that's the way you get in, and people will see that, right? I think the best leaders, not every leader, but most civilian, managers and leaders will start to recognize, this guy, he's good. He knows how to deal with this pressure and the stress. And I got another guy over there freaking out. I can't have a guy freaking out all the time. So I need someone who's good at it. So I think it is a superpower. It's something that should lean into.
So if I was a veteran or someone in active duty folks that are, they're planning on getting
Yeah.
out, they may have a date, they're 6 months out, they're
Yeah.
maybe 9 months out. What would you tell them to do to prepare now so that they'll have a better transition if they're
Yeah.
six,
Yeah.
9 months out?
Yeah. Read the book From Bunker Hill to the
Yes.
Boardroom. That's number one.
See, I was hoping you'd say that.
Get the
And
book.
we're gonna have a
Yeah.
link in the show notes, folks,
Perfect.
that you don't have to go look it up. It's kind of a longer title, but we'll have a link directly so you can go get the book directly in the show notes. So if you're driving, you don't have to try to write it down. You just be able to click on it and read up all on it. And so I'm sorry I interrupted, but I want to make
No,
sure
that's all right.
folks know that they don't have to
That's
remember it.
perfect. That's perfect. Thank you. No, I think part of it is really understanding. You got to do some research, and you can't just take. That's the other thing about the military. You also realize, at least in the aviation community in the Navy, most of the information you got about what was happening, what was next, the next command, the next position, whatever, it was all handed down.
Hmm.
We call it gouge, right? Hey, what's the gouge on that? What's the, and so I think at least for me, and in this day and age, maybe a little bit different, but the ability to do your own research and really understand what's going on out there and how things work. We just didn't do it. I just didn't do it in 2006, 2007. I just kind of I got a couple of recruiters who recruited junior military officers, and I just kind of believed them, like what the deal was. But I wish I had done a lot more of my own research about what kind of roles were out there, how it really worked, what the compensation looked like, what it looks like to work for a government contractor versus a large company versus a small company. I just didn't know, and I had no idea that there were all these different paths to walk and different things you can go do. So again, I go back to this idea of giving yourself as much surface area exposure to be lucky as possible. Start talking to people, start networking, go to local chamber of commerce, start putting yourself out there on LinkedIn. Hey, I'm transitioning. Here's all my qualifications. Like make networks, make content. On LinkedIn. Hey, here's things that I'm good at, right? Whatever that is,
Hmm.
so that people can find you. This day and age, I think people can come find you, and it's not nearly as hard as it used to be 20 years ago. But you have to make that effort. It's like anything else, and I think people too, when they start to think about their transition, they need to think about it um, either like a training exercise or that next qualification or that next, big military thing that they have to go do. They have to prepare for it like that. They have to do the research for it like that.
Oh
You have
yeah.
to do the work, right? And you get out of that work what you put into it, right? And if you expect to sort of get out and like show up at the place, the local Walmart or Amazon and be like, all right, hey, I was an E5 and I'm really good at all these things. Give me a job. And I'm like, get in line. There's
Right.
500 guys, who want a job here, right? And it's like,
Hmm.
what? What? I didn't know that, and so I think you have to do the work. At the end of the day, you just have to do the work and do the research.
Yeah, and well, the hard part is there's so much information out there.
True. Yeah.
Being able
Yeah.
to sift through it and recognize what is sometimes marketing and what is, real
Yeah.
and what is
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
what I find even now, because I'm
Yeah.
not in the market, but you can read a lot of stuff and there's a million
Yeah.
YouTubes and a million things.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
information overload is sometimes the harder part. But
It's true.
the things that I do find is talking to people and reaching
Yeah.
out, and people are very generous with their time, almost
100%. Yeah.
always.
Yeah.
Hey,
Yeah. And I found the veteran, especially the veteran community, if somebody reaches out to me, I'll do my best, and I'll say, I'll give you 20 minutes. You bet.
mhm,
Like I wish more people would. I wish more, I've had some vets, maybe 3 or 4 years out, kind of find me and say, hey, you bet, no problem. I'm happy to spend 20 or 30 minutes with you and give you some of my, whatever that advice, whatever that's worth, So, but I wish, I just feel like you're right. I feel like more people are uncomfortable to ask
mhm,
and ask for that help. There's also some great organizations. I'm sure you espouse a lot of them on this show. I've worked a little bit with a group called the Veteran Coaching Project up in
mhm.
the Northwest, up in the Northeast. Sorry, and they, resources around as vets transition. They bring in these sort of coaches who work in the civilian world, work with CEOs, this kind of thing, and just help you with your networking and kind of help
Yeah.
you expose yourself to more opportunities out there. And I think there are plenty of those resources locally and wherever, that's 9 months out, need to start finding them and figuring out what's out there.
And you had mentioned earlier, when you're in the military, you don't see your boss's boss's boss and then go strike up a
Right.
conversation. In the civilian world, you absolutely go reach out to whomever whenever,
Absolutely. That's
especially
right.
if you're trying to get a foothold
Yeah.
into an organization.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go do that. There is no harm. And it's
There,
not against the
there's
rules per se, because there aren't
right.
rules.
Yeah. Yeah. And the worst thing that someone's going to say is nothing, right? You're
Yeah.
going to get ghosted, right?
Leave you on red.
Or you very rarely are you going to get some note back like, you know, get out of here, pal. Try to keep it
Hmm.
PG. But like
Yeah.
you're not going to, even if they do, so what, right? At least you have an answer. And I think it is one of the hardest things in the civilian world is to sort of get uncomfortable with this idea of networking, of reaching out to people, introducing yourself. Here's who I am. Getting that 5-minute elevator pitch down.
Hmm.
Again, it's a real thing. You're in a hotel and you strike up a conversation. The guy says, "Oh yeah, I'm the VP of operations at the big plant here," and you go, "Hey, I'm transitioning. I'm an E5, and here's all the things that I did, and I reckon I'm looking for a role maybe like." Okay, here's my contact information, and you have to be able to do that, right? And if
Yeah.
you just kind of look at the guy and go, well, have a good day, then that opportunity walks out the elevator. And so you have to be ready to do it. It's hard. I get it. It's hard. Not everybody's sort of wired to do it. The better
Most
you
people
sort of
are
practice
not.
it, you can. Yeah,
Totally
the better. Yeah,
recognize that.
yeah,
But
yeah,
and the
exactly.
other half is titles are much more fluid in the civilian world.
Sure.
I was
Yeah,
reading a book about a guy that, was investing in Russia at the very beginning of, the wall coming
yeah,
down. And he said, I was a vice president at one of these investment firms. And he has a
sure.
footnote and he says, there were more vice presidents than secretaries. So don't be too impressed.
Yeah, no, most titles are inflated and bullshit. Sorry, I
Hmm.
have to end that one, but that's true, right? I mean, and especially on LinkedIn, and we could call this funny memes about LinkedIn sort of overinflation of your titles and things like that. But yeah, don't ever be buffaloed by somebody's title or prestige or all those kind of things. At the end of the day, it's everybody's just people, and
Hmm.
you're either willing to help or they're not. And if they're willing to help, then take the help, and it may not be exactly what you want. And not everyone's going to like, oh, nice to meet you. Here's a job. Right. But you also can, it's sometimes it's that next one and they introduce you to somebody and they introduce you to somebody and they introduce you to somebody and it's that fifth or sixth person that says, hey, come talk to me and interview for this position. And that's the one you get. So I think it's really about persistent. It's like anything else in the military. You have to be resilient, you have to be persistent, you have to learn new skills, and a lot of times and carry what you know from the military and try to adapt them to new environment.
I my next question is I'm just sort of pondering as you mentioned that. So when you transitioned, I guess the way to put it, what was the hardest part about moving from a structured environment where
Yeah,
you knew where the goalposts were? If
yeah,
you get commissioned after, so
yeah,
long you're a O2 and then O3 and then
yeah,
you're an Iron Major and then, like there was an
yeah,
entire structure and you knew where you were relative to your peers and to
yeah.
where that is and where everything was based on the collective we to
Right.
the corporate system where it's super heavily rewards individual
Yeah,
self-promotion and personal
yeah,
branding, even when
yeah,
you knew it was a bunch of malarkey. Uh,
yeah,
to,
yeah, yeah. Two things on that. I mean, the first is you go from, especially as aviation, living by the flight schedule. You would wait till 6 p.m. What am I doing tomorrow? And
mhm.
and and then you'd know, am I flying? Am I the simulator? Am I teaching? What am I doing? So the flight schedule dictated our life. And as I got out and you have a civilian job and they're like, you have a number to hit, good luck. Check in with your boss on Friday. And it's like, what do I do? And you have
Yeah.
to relearn how to be not self-disciplined, as I think we're all pretty disciplined. It's just like, okay, I have to structure my day. I have to figure this thing out. I have to do this myself. No one's going to help me, right? And you might have a boss that's sort of helpful. Maybe most don't, right? But like, good luck to you. You need to check in, and if you're behind, I'm going to fire you. And
Yeah.
those are the kind of rules of the road. So I think that was one of the hardest things is your own schedule now becomes your own. You have to manage your day and your time and your actions and your activity. And, you may come into an office, you may not, whatever the case is, you have to figure it out. And then I think the other thing, you kind of hit on is, yeah, the structured nature of the military and kind of where everybody is and all those kind of things. again, I go back to this, it's the politics that sort of surprise you,
Hmm.
and you just, you know, I always thought about it from the perspective, okay, I'm gonna move myself into management positions because I know I'm a better leader than the other guy. So I always felt like he was a service, right? Like better the team has me as their boss than that guy, or
Hmm.
that person. And then I was like, I'm always going to take care of my teams, right? And so, try to focus on the collective team, and that also gave you a bit more sense of purpose. So if you can move into management roles, and sometimes you take less money. Is one of the things I always counsel younger guys. I'm like, oh, how do I become a VP and an RVP and all those things? Like, well, you got to take less money. You have to take less money, and you have to deal with everybody's crap. Like, like, do you want to do that? Right. And they're like, well, I don't want to do that. Well, then why do you want the job? Well, I don't want the job. Well, there you go. Good talk.
Right. They
you know?
assumed that it meant more money, but it doesn't always.
Not always, I mean, again, the coach of an NBA team doesn't make what Jalen Brunson makes.
Hmm.
Right. So, it's the reality is, the leaders now at a certain level, yes, you get to a certain level and the responsibility becomes heavy enough that the compensation follows, right? But frontline leaders, frontline managers, yeah, you have to want to care about your teams, and want to be successful for their success, right? And that becomes
Hmm.
a different world. I think one of the hardest jobs in civilian world is this sort of middle management, where you have a frontline team that you have to manage, and you're worried about their livelihood and their performance, but you got a boss. And that boss is a little higher level, and he's putting pressure on you to put pressure on them. And how do you advocate and how do you win and those kind of things. So it's something a lot of leaders, military leaders have to sort of navigate as they come through and they get promoted, right? Hey, this guy's really great individual contributor. Hey, you're now the manager. Well, okay, great. I'm a leader. I can do all that. I had a platoon of guys. Now you're dealing with a different type of boss. You're dealing with a different type of pressure. You're dealing with a whole different type of thing. So there's definitely transition there too, not just from coming out and being an individual contributor.
And there's a lot of difference I see in the military. I'm coming from the army, but it's a lot of it is manufactured statistics of
Okay.
everybody's, green to go, good to go on their dental or weapons qual or,
Sure.
like
Yeah.
I don't want to say manufactured, but it's not like a
Yeah.
huge deal. Where,
Right.
hey, if you're not
Right.
hitting your sales, you're not, you're
Yeah.
or whatever
Right.
the thing
Right.
is a
Yeah.
whole different ball of wax in a real
Right.
business.
Yeah. We call that gun decking in the Navy, by the way. You just gun deck that qual. It's fine. He's fine, right? That kind of
We call it
stuff
pencil
somebody signs off on it.
qualifications because the holes for the bullets are about the same size as a pencil as you're counting. And
That's
oops.
just fine. Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Look at that. You hit the bullseye. Yeah, you're right. I mean, and I think most military, I think most of that's done in a spirit with which you and I are sort of joking about it, meaning we understand this sort of regulation is stupid, and so like we just need to move. This guy's fine, and we're going to move forward with it. So I think what you see in the civilian world when this kind of stuff happens, it's nefarious, right?
Hmm.
It's done with malintent, in order to deceive, an auditor or to make the numbers look better or things like that. And I think, it's where your ethics and morals, honor, courage, commitment, whatever, you sort of learn in the military really stands veterans out as well as like, I remember early in my career, and I won't tell the full story, but there was a guy doing something I totally disagreed with, and I took, to HR and said, hey, this is what happened. I disagree with this, and I'll leave it in your hands, and ultimately, let the guy go. And I don't regret that, right? Because I think you can't, sacrifice your ethics, your morals, your integrity just because you're now in a fluid civilian world situation, right? And I think for me, I believe that those type of people will still rise to the top. That these kind of bad actors for the short term will survive a little bit, but ultimately they don't make it. And I think if you just continue to sort of rest on the things that you learn and are true to yourself, you'll be fine.
So one of the things I really liked about the book is it's very up to date. We're talking about AI,
Yep.
that you mentioned the release of ChatGPT is sort of a modern day TED offensive. And
Yeah.
I thought that was
Yeah.
pretty
Yeah.
interesting analogy because I love
Yeah.
AI, but I'm
Yeah.
also a university professor. So I see
Okay.
a lot of AI attempts with students, and I'm like, no, no, no. If you use it enough, you recognize things that are being
Sure.
written and edited, and
Yep.
you're like, no,
Yep.
no, you need to go back and reread it, or we're going to have a
Yep.
whole conversation so I know that you understand it.
Right.
but there's a difference between, and I see it, and I just all over the place. People are adopting AI in things that have no AI basis, just to say
Right.
they have AI in it.
Sure.
So I
Sure.
wanted you to talk a little bit about what you think about the AI in the job market and how
Sure.
companies are
Yeah.
adapting. Because I thought it was
Yeah.
pretty interesting. I haven't
Yeah.
seen that in this type of book.
Yeah, no, I mean, and the work that I do is in AI and technology and healthcare now, and so it's a lot big part of what I do all the time. And yeah, with the release of ChatGPT, I mean, when we got time to talk about it in the book, when electricity took 50 years to sort of fully adopt, computers 30, the internet sort of 5 to 10, but AI sort of hit. That's why I talk about the Tet Offensive. Like it was sudden, it was an assault on the system. Everybody like, holy cow, what is going on here? And so I think you see the pendulum swung hard, and a lot of the senior AI leaders, Sam Altman, these guys, this is the end of white collar entry level jobs. In 3 years, no one would need one, blah, blah, blah. It's not the case, right? At the end of the day, we are seeing slowing down of those type of roles, but AI, like everything else that we use, I think about the military. Would you rather have, an old musket from the Revolutionary War, or would you rather have that AR-15, right? Like
Hmm.
it is a tool. It is a much more effective tool than what there was previously. And if you don't learn to use it, if you go to battle with the old, Long Betty, right, from the, you're probably going to get shot, right? So I just, the reality is this is a tool that's out there. The competitors are going to use it. They're going to find out. Sure, there's a lot of confusion about how organizations can best adopt, how they can push it down to their staff, how they can use it, all those kind of things. But at the end of the day, it is a tool that's not going anywhere. And it's
Hmm.
only going to get better. It's only going to get smarter. It's only going to get faster. It's only going to automate more and more. And so, as leaders coming out of the military, you see AI in the military too now. We're starting to see autonomous airplanes and, not just drones, but fully AI driven, aircraft like Shield and things like that. And so you're starting to see all of the AI also come out in military warfare. You just have to adapt, right? It goes back to
Hmm.
adaptive intelligence. It hit hard, it hit fast. Transitioning veterans, it needs to be in your tool belt. You can't just come in with the hammer and saw. You need to know AI too, and it needs to be something that you're versed in, that you can utilize, that you can prove that it's something that you can work with and not just be left behind as well. So I think it is. I think it is a modern day, sort of assault, in the same way. And on most business leaders kind of freaked out early, and I think now we're settling into, okay, let's try to adopt, intelligently and to some degree, and let's not freak out too much about how we hire and fire people.
Yeah, I think you're definitely going to see it more and more, but it's also the use cases and how to use
Yeah.
it and integrate it. And that's a little bit harder because you have to understand what the processes are that you're trying to fix or
Yeah.
replicate. And,
Yeah.
I think you're going to see a lot more with, art and things like that. I know a number of people that are artists that are very freaked out because if I want a graphic artist, I can just ask AI and I can do it myself in 20 minutes with
Sure.
no artistic ability at all.
Yeah.
Whereas,
Yeah.
before I'd have to hire someone and know what they look, what their work looks like. And
Right.
so you're going to
Right.
see some of that dynamic changes. But in general,
Sure.
I'm a big fan. But at the same time, it'll definitely change the marketplace. So
Yeah.
we've been talking with Andy Moye that from Bunker Hill to the Boardroom, battle-tested leadership for today's executives. We're going to make sure the show notes are in the bottom. Andy, first, thank you so much for joining us on Coming Home Well. I really enjoyed the book. Folks, go get it. It's a great book. We'll have the link. I sped through it. I think I read it in like a day and a half and not
Right.
full time. But
Yeah.
so it's not super, like War and Peace, which I started not too long ago, and I
Yeah.
forgot just how large of a book that is. But
Yeah.
there's some
Yeah.
really great insights, and I didn't want to give away like all the great stories, but
Sure.
Andy has some great in things all the way from the Revolutionary War to Captain George Moye back in the
Right.
Revolutionary War,
Yeah.
all the way through modern day, including
Yeah.
some challenges he had while flying the P-3 in
Yeah.
Iraq and change of mission. It's a pretty great story because, like, as far as I know, they're not armed. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
And sitting up, in a
Yeah.
contested airspace is
Yeah.
scary, especially since aircraft do get shot down. Later in the war, not as much. In the early part, there were a lot of surface-to-air missiles still out there. So it wasn't just like, hey, yeah, we own the airspace, no biggie. Go read the book. I don't want to give it away. Andy, thank you so much for joining us on Coming Home Well. And again, thanks so much for writing the book.
Yeah, no, thank you, Tyler. You're doing a great service here at the podcast and helping veterans. So appreciate the opportunity to come on.
Appreciate it, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right.
Thanks for joining us this week on Coming Home Well with Dr. Tyler Pieron. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and a review. Thanks again. And until all are home and all are well, this is Coming Home Well.